So yeah, it's an honor. It's an honor being here. I was just sharing before. It's quite some time ago that I did an online lecture, so I was also a bit nervous. And it's very nice to be invited. And like the project you're running is super important. And as it was said, it's quite close or related to actually things I'm thinking, dealing about, or working on. So it's great to see a community from different kind of fields coming together to discuss openly about how we can make some impact and changes. So we are even an hour ahead of you, like 6 o'clock in the evening, and I know that you all had like a long day already. So I hope I can be informative as well as inspiring, and I would be very happy to receiving questions and feedback. And if it's some urgent question you can't wait to kind of clarify, you just interrupt me. But currently, all your images are gone, so you just need to shout loud that I know that I should kind of make a stop. So thanks, Ferdinand. You actually covered all of the things I could say or would say about myself. But maybe just to add on that, for me it has been quite a shift when I was relocating from ETH Zurich to Aalto University some years ago. But as I have a strong interest in creating new trajectories, the offer to relocate or to set up a completely new field at Aalto University was very close to my heart, because I really enjoy working and being inspired with other fields. And Aalto University is one of the strengths of Aalto University is actually that we have and should work across the traditionally siloed fields of areas, which is also due to the fact that it's even so the biggest, I think the biggest university in Finland, or at least the most progressive one next to Helsinki University. We are the biggest architecture department, but of course in an international comparison we are quite small. So the School of Arts, Design and Architecture, as the name says, holds also fields like fashion design, like media design and art, and that is very close or interesting for me, where I'm looking into immersive data interaction. So maybe just to say that I position my research in the context of immersive data-informed processes across scales to define possible avenues for tackling the complex global challenges we are facing. And I do not believe in viewing the built and the unbuilt as separate entities. Rather, I'm interested in strengthening the flows of the interaction between them. And again, thank you so much for the invitation. It has been really interesting, and especially after giving the keynote at DLA, I was kind of looking into what is the angle I would like to share or discuss with you. So some of the ones who might have been listening to the DLA might recognize some elements on it and can maybe relate to that. So let's start a bit like with something which still drives me a bit how to say, like nervous and partly annoyed. So at least in the Nordics context, the discussion when it comes to environmental design is quite often looking into, let's say, these abstract models you see in here. So if we look into municipalities, but even into, let's say, decision makers, since almost over 2 decades, we are looking into these abstract models to approach our increasing complex challenges, as we can see in this system model of a sustainable development diagram, and which through adding of the areas of technology, humanity, and institutional factors is regarded as a smart development model. We have all been seeing these kind of diagrams, and we have been all dealing with terminologies like smart cities, which is equally difficult and broad as the term sustainability itself. So these kind of terms, they have become a kind of a household term across the globe, and is still very often regarded as solution to complex and dynamic challenges. And this means, and I'm talking about myself and my research lab, so that means that we are looking, from my perspective, into simplified performative types of architecture, like often a development of design which attempts to achieve step changes in performance. And that is realized through the use of innovative digital tools, techniques, and methods in the design, manufacturing, and in the construction process, right? So we are talking a lot about performance as a driver in the design and planning process, as a prerequisite to achieve buildings and cities which perform better, which ideally click all the sustainable development goals, which function and operate, consume fewer resources in construction and operation, and offer a healthier and more comfortable environments to its occupants. So it seems to be the overarching goal of the contemporary discussion. And I talked about that this is often achieved with, let's say, digital tools, and I would say such computerization, and I really ask you to pay attention on the term computerization, as this approach has nothing to do with computation, and I will talk about that quite soon. So again, such computerization of this digital production increases economic efficiency, but leaves the intellectual foundation of our discipline largely untouched. So here at Aalto University, in collaboration with colleagues like Tony Kotnik, or also colleagues from, let's say, neighboring fields, we have established a lab which is exploring strategies to describe complex challenges from a different angle beyond the contemporary linear and technocentric approach, which is often juxtaposing the city, nature, and the unknown future. So this approach we are looking into aims at improved resilience of our urban environments and the activation of cities and nature as generators of a balanced habitat, which resonates a lot with the statement by Bruno Latour, which in a nutshell looks into how to find a place to land, meaning we need to reconnect to the ground condition, as he calls it, the critical zone, understanding the planetary boundaries. In this reconnection, or the kind of losing of the ground condition, is something which since maybe a year drives me quite interested. It is also something I would like to discuss and share with you. So I have structured this talk, which should go around 35 to 40 minutes max, around a bit like of theoretical introduction at the beginning, kind of sharing with you in a way the models, the methodologies our lab's work resonates with, and I will end with a couple of more tangible projects which offer then hopefully a foundation for a discourse, a conversation about the themes I'm introducing to you. So this specific way of thinking and interacting with complexity in the realm of computational design thinking allows us to zoom out and to rethink the way we approach design in general. So the work I'm talking about is driven by a methodological approach in order to simulate if and when a system of negotiation reaches for an equilibrium, and also questioning if an equilibrium is actually the goal we should aim for, right? And if it's possible to allow that all elements are actually reaching a stable position, if we are facing kind of dynamic changes we can not even predict precisely within these dynamic processes, in order to rethink the relationship between the mankind and flora and fauna, and ideally finding a way to change the trend which I was just describing. So I had shown this image before, which is actually from our newly appointed professor of sustainable design here at Aalto University, who really advocates for architects should not build at all anymore. And I'm looking into going beyond an anthropocentric or man-centered construction culture. And we also know that, right? We have initiated the 6th-phase extinction of species already. And as the population of mankind has been growing, we are consuming more and more materials. And at the moment, half of the global raw materials are used for construction. So the current problem in terms of biodiversity and other negative impacts like CO2 emission on the global ecosystem is expected to increase. And I can just share out of discussion I had actually in a Zoom meeting this morning with some Singaporean projects we are running with, where they still look into land reclamation by using sand, right? So this kind of thinking is very difficult for us in a way to let go. And as defined by the field of ecology, everything is related to everything else. This supports the thesis that the solution to the challenges we face, from, again, my point of view, lies not in discussion the city and nature separately or following up superficial greenifying strategies. Rather, I'm looking into a new nature, and that I would like to do that in quotation mark. So a mix of technology and the natural, emphasizing nature's makeability and artificiality in order to create responsive and adaptive environments. And this is also important that obviously we are still trying to control and predict everything. And the massive increase in scale that is often involved means that the traditional tools of design cannot proper advantage of the wealth of information at our disposal. And quite often the discussion is only focused on singular new technological possibilities rather than on the understanding of the connections of the different parameters, which can be decoded through understanding their patterns. And that's why, for me, working with ecologists is super enriching, because they have a completely different understanding of dynamic interactions. And they are looking also in patterns, whereas quite often from architecture, look into aesthetics. Within the ecology, the shift in the discussion is really more on the behaviors. So coming back to the first law of ecology, it means that cause and action, like understanding the needs of the future user of a space, and we also need to ask of who is it actually we are designing for, right? Is it a human, an animal, a plant, is it a robot, or any other forms of interactions, needs to be done within the surrounded space, and obviously has an impact on the larger global system. So computational design thinking, just to shortly clarify, is not focused on form or the division between the built and the unbuilt, but rather on the underlying process of formation governed by a network of relationships, which are expressed through patterns of interactions. And this is what drives me in the work, and also what I'm kind of discussing or showing with you, that a lot still, from my perspective, needs to be done in actually decoding this behavior, kind of trying to understand what are the relationships in between. So the needed transition from computerization to computational design represents a profound shift in design thinking and methods. So as we all know, representation is being replaced by simulation, and the crafting of objects is moving towards the generation of integrated systems through designer-authored computational processes. And while there's a particular history of such methods and approaches in architecture, it's interesting to see that even so landscape architecture, and I'm working at the intersection, is very close to ecology. There's not so much understanding of this kind of computational methods within landscape architecture, which requires a special attention towards the notion of a process, right? So it's not about a reductionism approach. It is really about a kind of systemic interaction, like a systemic complexity we're looking in. So the discussion on computational potentials inherently asks us to define elements of landscape architecture and urban or architecture, like associated characteristics, sorry for that, rules, actions, and relationships that form a new type of a model. And therefore, we have to strive to understand the interrelationships of multiple, not inherently formal, but synthetic models that define methods for designing living systems, utilizing the data, the metrics, and the speculations. So by expanding on the principles of systemic complexity, we can interact with complexity, and that's not important, not by reducing or diminishing it, but by approaching it in a creative manner through the definition of new computational design protocols. And this is extremely important, and I take a very creative and speculative angle on that, because the complexity in which we are operating is quite overwhelming. And if we tried to put certain kind of elements from an architectural point of view into this overview, and we all know that, right? So we will have around 2.5 billion people more living in cities in 2050. And I just used Helsinki and not Munich because Helsinki sounds a bit more impressive. So it means we have to build 128 times Helsinki in 1 year for each year until 2050 in order to kind of accompany, find places for these people. And that means that at the same time, we are asked to bring the emission down to zero, and we need to build much faster than today if we think that we would like to continue building that or continue having the culture of architecture in that way. So this kind of aspect of providing space for living in, let's say, in new ways is super important. And we have to look into the role of design, which is in the triangle at the very bottom of this diagram, to see that novel forms of building configurations are actually needed. So really new forms of passive design strategies that focus on utilizing the natural environment to provide heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting to a building. And unlike active design strategies that rely on the mechanical system and processes, passive design strategies depend more on the laws of nature. And this, of course, requires then all the other elements like the food we need for that. And it gets even more obvious if we compare the ratio of urban and build-up land in comparison to the overall Earth's surface, what we see up here. So that like a very small chunk of space actually is in charge of a lot of problems we are causing, and like sea level rise, desertification, and so on and so forth. And if we're looking once more into the growth of the cities and the land area which is used and the kind of impacts it has on loss of biodiversity, and on the other hand, the topics which are for us there to kind of rethink, this gets quite interesting and also quite understandable that nothing we can do here can be done by only one discipline. And I love this diagram, so I'm also showing it again, because if we add on the diagrammatic overview the notion of ethics and values, which is quite often not really looked at, this graphic impressively visualizes our world as a mountain of global heating, tracing the rise of atmospheric CO2 emissions against a linear time scale. And the ubiquitous rising line of greenhouse gas emission is not an empty abstraction, but it's built up on what we're seeing in here, right? It's built up on extractive practices, which is a line that needs to come down. So the mountain is cut along the axis of the present to reveal various layers, the sediments that have collectively produced the steepening of the mountain. So each of the 6 sedimentary layers, which you can see over here, like on the left-hand side, is identified by a word describing the forces that have accelerated the production of CO2 in relation to the production of the built environment. And as a dear colleague, a former colleague from ETH and friend kind of states, Georg Fachliotis from TU Delft, it is really, and I'm not going to talk in depth about AI and kind of generative design, but I'm like the time we are at really means like we need to kind of ask bigger and more relevant questions. So what is it actually we are doing, right? So what is the kind of job and task for us in a time which we need to seek a balance between AI, datafication, and the kind of increasing complex challenges? And moving from the theoretical reflection towards a conversation about the process of contextual figuration, like what I said before, what was stated by Bruno Latour. So how can we land without crashing? The lens of computational design thinking with the speculative data interaction is something I am exploring. And I will now firstly really shortly investigate the articulation of these flexible relationships between the entities, often denominated as topological diagrams. And it's argued that, or I argue that these diagrams not only govern the use of the contextual data, but are organized as nearly decomposable web of diagrams. And from a system theory perspective, this web of diagram is embedded into the web of laws of nature. So that means architecture is inscribed into its natural surroundings as man-made extension. We all know that. And with such an understanding, computational design intentionally shifts away from the design of objects, of elements, of consumption, of environmental resources, towards the design of interrelationships, of interactions with the environment. And the design of architecture, of cities, of landscapes and territories is not anymore about the mere enhancing of environments. It's really about building environments themselves, which can be seen with a series of historical references, out of which the first one is really kind of impressive, the 19th century German naturalist and explorer Alexander von Humboldt. And as we are in a more like a German-speaking environment, this is nothing new for us, but basically what he has been doing with the section of the map, where he was kind of carefully mapping the species, but he was also looking into the way that climate, geography, nature and humans are interconnected. And in relation to ecology, he already said that everything is interaction and reciprocal, which is super important. So he very systematically documented and understood the impact of human action on natural world, highlighting already at that time the way that colonialist interventions upset ecological balances. And similar interactions and understandings of the relationship of topology and typography of the land, the kind of human interventions, was discussed with Sir Patrick Geddes in the Cities in Evolution, and obviously the overlay of information, which was quite influential on landscape architecture in the milestone book Design with Nature by Ian McCarg. And that kind of goes along with these diagrams, which just shows that what has been discussed, or what's currently discussed on the critical zone kind of conversation and the understanding of planetary boundaries, is something that we have seen in architecture, where there is a shift on the focus on, let's say, the object. This kind of detached from the environment towards more integral forms. And the contextual figuration of the ground, which you see on the right, really relates back to Bruno Latour and his reflection on the critical zone, because it illustrates a shift from viewing the building not as an isolated object, but really as an integral part of the urban and environmental context. And I'm closing this kind of diagrammatic discussion with this last overview. So this series of diagrams really summarized the previous discussion from a figuration of the ground to the figuration of the figure to the most right diagram, illustrating how mapping, projecting and transversal interactions of layers of information support the formation of landscape that are coherent and functionally adaptive. So this approach emphasizes a deep systemic understanding of the interrelationships between the natural and human systems, moving beyond the superficial correlation. And I guess you have all seen that, but I still think it's just super interesting to kind of repeat on that. So what was theorized by Bruno Latour, or what he took up on further discussion, the critical zone understood as a thin layer several hundred meters thick above and below the surface of our planet, in which the human activity has a significant impact on Earth's geology and ecosystem. So the term critical zone is actually invented by Earth scientists, so which call for bringing together the different disciplines. So it's in a way, it really looks into if the disconnection between the world we live in and the world we live from is really the cause of the disorientation, then the remedy is clear. We should find ways to decrease the distance between the two worlds, so as to begin our landing on Earth without crashing. And I quote Rachel Liebeskind saying like, nature owes us nothing, which I found is super important and also kind of leads into this understanding the complexity. So understanding the driver of complexity is very important to unveil strategies of designing cities which are sustainable and resilient as they are high-quality places. And we all know that if we kind of look into design and the relationships from different angles, we can understand how they can be adaptive, dynamic, and goal-seeking because they are defined by certain parameters which are adjusting. So they can even have sometimes evolutionary behavior. So in order that we accommodate the complex issues facing the profession today, we actually must explore these new interdisciplinary design strategies and look into new connections of systems. So I'm actually interested in designing system boundaries, right? So a first step is to understand our world in all its complexity by encoding different systems and entities. And if we zoom into them, we can understand how this new overlay of certain systems can actually accommodate for new adaptation to be generated. So it's really in looking into the creation of permeable system boundaries which allow for novel forms of interactions to emerge. And with that in mind, and now I'm getting more in a way like to wake you up, I'm now getting more into images and into examples. So this is a series of images we took here in the archipelago, just outside of where I'm sitting right now. And we all know that you could show me, let's say, different but comparable images from the areas where you're from. Each and every spot on Earth is unique because of its cultural context, the climate, the topography, and the location. So on these images, you actually see the geomorphological structures which unveil a rich history, a rich story about the history, but as well engage with the ecological processes of the future. So allowing myself to be a bit critical again in here, I really do ask myself when I'm walking along the shoreline where we took the images you see in here, why do a lot of city developments look similar and exchangeable? Even so, the local environment is totally different. So we have a lot of new harbor districts emerging in Helsinki, and they look like a mini copy of Amsterdam. So does using the same methods mean that the outcome needs to be the same? And if we are interested in an exchange of the design strategies, how can we kind of let the local environment and the local player be the key components? So it's truly not about, in a way, this reductionist approach is quite difficult if we try to deal with complexity in order to make clusters of the same, because we are losing the relationships and the kind of needs in between them. And that's why we are kind of speculating. We call it, it's a working title. We call it the terraformed interface you see in here, right? So in contrast to a traditional data overlay design strategy, which was in the history also by Ian McHarg and GIS kind of developed, we expand towards dynamic components of hidden information within the medium, and we quite a lot use the point clouds. So we kind of build up on the methodology which was developed by the team of Christoph Giraud at ETH Zurich. And this immersive focus on dynamic components of a specific area empowers to actively influence the interplay between architecture, landscape architecture, societal dynamics, and the environmental framework at large. So it's exactly within this context that the terraformed interface offers for us a speculative entry point for interdisciplinary exchange, inspired by the advocacy for a terrestrial reorientation by thinkers such as Bruno Latour in the planetary boundaries framework proposed by Johann Ekström to call for symbiotic coexistence with the planet's diverse life forms. And I'm starting with having a look into the territory stratum first. And we'll start with a couple of examples here from Finland or from the Nordics, which shows you in a way what I was trying to explain, that the hidden kind of interactions between the different agents of a local territory can lead into new understanding of what design or like what can be future-oriented designs. So the first example is a research case which resulted into a master thesis project titled From Systems to Patterns and Back, exploring the role of dynamic patterns in the area of regional planning. And Ida Chrisjute, who is currently making her PhD at ETH Zurich, has been working on that project, which has been a contribution to our city science research collaboration with MIT Media Lab with the team of Kent Larson. So this topic is actually, even though it's now already a couple of years old, it became more and more topical, not only with the ongoing, let's say, war between the Ukraine and Russia, but obviously driven by the more and more impactful melting of the Arctic, right? So it opens up a very topical and geopolitical discussion on the Arctic in a kind of more global understanding. And I kind of shortly share here with you the Arctic Council, which is comprised of quite many countries who have more and more, or feel they have more and more to say on the Arctic. And why is this kind of driven? Is that one of the effects of the melting Arctic ice is the political power game on the polar Silk Route, which you can see here on the map. And this is giving a completely new importance on the northern shoreline of Norway, Sweden, and Russia. Finland is actually not reaching the kind of the open sea, but nevertheless, it empowers the discussion on opening up new mines, also in Finland, quite a lot in the Nordics, with the discussion on new types of Arctic settlement and harbor construction. So within all that, within this discussion, this research presents a data-driven framework to explore the role of dynamic time and direction patterns in the area of Finnish Lapland, in which we looked at, in order to improve decision-making in complex urban and landscape planning and design tasks. So the project presents a dynamic evidence-based planning and decision support tool using a diverse range of digital technologies to incorporate dynamic variables in urban and landscape spatial analysis and methodology. So concretely, it has dealt with the conflicting interests between the Arctic Ocean Railway, which you see here on the red line, a new railway which has been planned for quite some time from the Finnish government. And it's in conflict with, let's say, silent and non-silent stakeholders. So it's in strong conflict with the local reindeer distribution, which has their own, so the kind of Sami, the indigenous culture of the whole of Lapland, is still having like their kind of reindeers are freely moving around the territory, and they are informed by, let's say, the cycles of environmental processes. And on the other hand, we have mining industry, we have tourism, and we have geological or geopolitical kind of power games. And what we were looking at is designing an agent-based model using a different representation and abstraction features for different dynamic data packages. Because the thing we could control is obviously the train line. The things we cannot really control is the movement patterns of the reindeers. We can just kind of slightly predict that. And what are the trade-offs in the discussion? So the project is integrated within the Gamma simulation platform and embedded in the MIT Cityscope framework, a medium for both analyzing agent-based behavioral patterns and displaying them to the stakeholders. And in that short summary, you see, in a short movie, you see a summary of the components focusing on these data-driven design methods for dynamic territorial typologies and collaborative design, where we kind of made a communication tool which is in real time giving you feedback on the different changes you're doing. So the MIT City Science Lab works with these Lego blocks, which have like sensors below the blocks. And you can kind of code the different blocks with different kind of patterns of behavior. And in the back, you see the kind of overview. If you change different, let's say, parameters on the desktop, you get a real-time feedback. So basically, you could kind of simulate different tracks, the different kind of time, the different kind of dynamic distributions in order to understand the magnitude of the impact. I'm staying in the Arctic. I'm moving to the biosphere stratum. And we are looking into Iceland, where I took out a couple of images because we are also streaming on Facebook, and you will see these images quite soon in an upcoming publication. So this is basically a work in progress, which works together with the Icelandic University, and particularly the turf fiction project. So this research project's turf fiction, meaning like turf and fiction, approaches the Icelandic turf house as a superorganism and speculates on how its way of being, skills, and needs can help us rethink today's architecture and knowledge of nurturing coexistence. So it engages in multi-species politics and raises questions on the role of architecture in reconfiguring human and non-human temporal belongings, cohabitation, and care. And you find more about that on the turffiction.org homepage. So what are we looking at? The research is a speculative approach looking into the potential to reveal new pathways for adaptive design and future-oriented forms of living that respond to both visible and invisible environmental factors. And you see here a couple of historical images of the Icelandic turf house, which actually dates back to the first settlement period in the 9th centuries, which was mainly kind of Vikings coming from Norway. And it represents a unique vernacular form where human habitation coexists symbiotically with the natural landscape, the flora and fauna. And the structures, which persisted as a primary form of housing in Iceland until the 20th century. So this is quite recent, actually, mainly during the First and Second World War, that people were introduced to, let's say, concrete buildings. People were still living in these typologies of housing, were crafted from very reduced amount of materials. So basically, they were using earth, particularly turf. They were using lava stone, and they were using driftwood, because through the Vikings, they have chipped off the whole forest of Iceland for their boats. So there was hardly any forest existing on Iceland anymore. So that's why building and living in these harsh environment conditions could only work with finding a material like the turf, which is a living material, but through the kind of insects and the microbes, the roots are actually holding the turf bricks together. And that's how they could kind of make this arrangement of housing typologies where also the scale of the houses is informed by the static elements or property of the scarness of the materials. So it really reflects a deep integration with the surrounding environment. And we are interested not so much in the wide areas, which are the spaces like the rooms for living, for in a way cooking, for having their animals, but we are interested in the spaces in between, where we put the collage in the back. So this is actually the constructed turf walls. They vary in the thickness because a turf wall can only exist between 30 and 50 years. Afterwards, you just need to rebuild it. So it's a structured typology which is in constant flux. They have been constantly changing, adding rooms, merging rooms, changing rooms, right? So by investigating the turf house as a living landscape composed of soil, plants, microbial life, and human influence, the study promotes a shift from static design paradigms to dynamic adaptive systems that emphasize resilience and cohabitation. And here you see how you can create actually this or how they have been creating these turf blocks. So the research approaches the turf house as a model of living architecture with materials and organisms contributing to an interconnected ecological network. Treating the materials as active agents shifts the perspective towards an ecological ontology that views built spaces as dynamic, evolving entities. And underlying these ecological processes, both above and below ground, are these microbial communities that enable these processes, thus connecting the different living and non-living actors of the ecosystem. So we make genetic sequencing. We kind of constantly find new types of microbes. There's even evidence that certain microbes are producing natural antibiotics. So basically, the whole discussion which has been brought during the Second World War that it would be unhealthy to live in these earth holes actually has shown that there was a reason why people were living in exchange with the microbes for this huge amount of years, right? So it really, we are focusing now in this immersive data interaction on the human microbial interdependence, whose particularities ought to be considered in building the Arctic environment. And as this is a work in progress, we will not show the kind of high-end results, but it's an outlook at this stage indicating on how we're using adaptive and predictive ecological modeling to support the examination of environmental impacts such as glacier melt, soil degradation, and biodiversity shift within a simulated environment. And on top of that, we are creating speculative narratives developed in this framework, which reveal the hidden connections, such as the interactions between the humans and the microbes. So shift in scales in the VR environment allow us to actually understand the exchanges and illustrate the temporal and spatial interplay across these diverse ecosystems, right? So through this immersive and data-driven storytelling, the research advances a conceptual model for future-oriented forms of cohabitation, where architecture and landscape are reimagined as responsive, co-created environments that adapt with ecological rhythms. And we are currently employing AI-enhanced simulations to project potential ecological futures, and how this kind of thinking maybe allows us to rethink architectures from a non-static to an actually dynamic form, which responds to the global and dynamic changes of the climate. So Ferdinand, just that you're not getting nervous, I'm running through 3 more minutes with the last project, and then I'm closing. So I will do that really shortly, because I guess a couple of you have seen that already in the DLA. But I will be ending with the cultural landscape stratum, which has been in a way the starting project for the whole kind of discussion. And we, since quite some years, we're working together with Singapore University of Technology and Design. And we have been exploring and working on this 24-kilometer stretch, which was a former train line connecting Malaysia, which you see here on the top, down to the port of Singapore. And especially during COVID, they were not able to actually move very quickly with the densification plans they had in Singapore. So this 24-kilometer long stretch stayed untouched. And that was one of the few areas in whole Singapore where suddenly bikers and people understanding in a way a local ecosystem, which was not kind of interfered with, because since 10 years ago, the trains had still been running. And 10 years ago, they had shut down the train line, and Singapore bought back that land from Malaysia. So it was fenced. And that's why there has been developed a very kind of unique local ecosystem. And now they are looking into their different approaches. Parts of it has been restored as a park. Others is probably going to be programmed. Other areas are under the fear to be kind of just built in order to connect neighboring building areas. So what we have been doing we kind of looked with an ecologist to better understand the complexities of this delicate web of interspecies relationships, which are dependent on what's happening in the left and in the right. So we kind of formulated an agent-based model to simulate a limited food chain of created species. So we selected butterflies as the main representative species of the model due to their role as valuable indicators of the global environmental health and vulnerability to habit deterioration. So we formed a kind of an overview using the data we had from the back, like from 1980 to 2020, where we were looking into the 3 species, butterfly and 2 bird species, how they have been developing. And we were kind of changing or indicating the point cloud with information about the healthiness of the species. And we kind of defined 3 visually distinct zones in the point cloud, which were corresponding to the temporal parameters of the species occurrence data, and even a speculative projection of their decreasing numbers in the future. So here you see how we took, in a way, the ecological information, as well as the information on the species behavior. We were kind of making them in abstraction in order to have them simulated in virtual reality. And we're kind of also introducing a species as a count manager in the simulation. And the behavior of this individual agent is grounded in this predatory-prey dynamics, which is integrating the Reynolds flocking movement principles. So you could basically also, when you were in virtual reality, you had 2 options. You can either observe the species interaction over time, or you could become one of the species, which was super convincing, because then your kind of interactions were coded by the species behavior, right? So the user could kind of transition their perspective into an animal, granting a new spatial experience, or from the sky while guided by the species behavior. And that over time allowed to understand, if we are kind of reflecting on how densification kind of comes closer, what other kind of interrelationships. Why I like that project, and I show it quite often, is actually that it had an impact we were not foreseeing. So it was not only allowing us to have a new discussion with, let's say, ecologists and social scientists and kind of, let's say, the planning institutes, but it also helped decision makers actually to let go from their predefined understanding of their own values. And this shift of perspective really led to completely new forms of communication, similarly to the very first example where we had the Lego table, where suddenly you let go because you became an active person in the whole chain. You let go of your previous understanding and could come to a consensus, which normally I was not actually imagining that would happen. So just to conclude, it's really about like setting our focus from not how to do it anymore, but really towards what is to be done and how are we reaching that. And I like the conversation about this computing landscapes with an intentionally kind of dash in between the two terms. So really advocating for generative design, landscape and natural processes as fundamental transitional concepts that operates on fields and boundary conditions. And to close the loop, so instead of this annoying smart city discussions, I'm putting biodiversity in the circle. And with all the work we are doing, also with the municipalities, we actually show how the different fields can actually create a different understanding of nature positive cities, and how these 2 things, if we put them as a starting point of the discussion, can actually lead to new articulations of future forms of cohabitation. So yeah, with that, I thank you very much for the attention, and I hope you enjoyed the reflection. Thank you so much.
Follow us in this shift to multi-species design through ECOLOPES. Find out more about our research on www.ecolopes.org and on our social media platforms.